warmists want to tell us that our burning of fossil fuels is another synthetic way in which we modify the climate in a major way. And they use computer models and theories to predict how that change will take place as we go forward. They like to look 50 to 100 years out based on that and project how much the warming that they think will take place will affect the melting of the Greenland and Antarctic ice shields and the rising of sea levels. That's where they try to scare us into controlling our use of fossil fuels and burning of fossil fuels and energy. But there's very little correlation, very poor correlation over the last 100 years with increasing CO2 and temperature rise. The history, and you go back millions of years, has been that the Earth has had much longer periods of time with much higher carbon dioxide levels, and that the carbon dioxide tends to follow, not lead, the temperature. In other words, the temperature warms and then the carbon dioxide increases. The temperature cools and then the carbon dioxide diminishes, and not the other way around, as they're trying to tell us that is the case now. And they use the ice cores from Antarctica, which they processed and found using that CO2 was very, very constant for many, many millennia up until the 1900s when it began to rise, and they attributed that to man. But actual fact that those ice cores were contaminated, that there are other scientists who say that the old data before 1900, even 1950, can't be trusted in the ice cores because those cores partially melted, and as soon as you start melting the ice, any pockets of air that was contained in the ice, and that's where they measure the whole levels of CO2. When there's liquid water, the carbon dioxide quickly goes into the water, and concentrations are shown to be inaccurately low as a result of that, so that you can't trust the old data from the ice cores. But it was convenient because it showed that the Earth was a constant, in a constant state up until man started burning fossil fuels. So it told their story very nicely. There were many direct observations of CO2 going back to 1800, 90,000 direct observations all across Europe, and they showed a much more variable CO2 pattern that peaked in the 1860s, 1850s. It dropped off again, peaked again in 1940s, dropped off, and then rose again as we warmed in the later part of the 20th century. And those levels of CO2 tracked the temperatures or followed the temperature rises.
You know, Joe, I just want to tell you my bias on the fossil fuels. I'm really into the facts. And one of the things I appreciate is that you're willing to totally give us the facts and present the facts in context to us. I've learned so much from you and the other people that I've interviewed. However, there's one part of the fossil fuel equation that I'm not okay with, and that is separate from anything having to do with climate per se, which is that I just don't like polluting or high-risk, dangerous technologies. It's just where I come from. I don't like the mercury put into the air. I don't like a lot of the contaminants that are put into the air. And I don't think we ultimately need to be doing it. But that doesn't mean that I'm not willing to look at the detail having to do with CO2 and learn the facts of how we evaluate that, what follows what. And so I can hear what you're saying. my issue having to do with fossil fuels is mostly having to do with pollution.
Most people believe that CO2 is pollution. They look at pictures of power plant smokestacks, and they'll see this effluent come out, and it's really condensed water vapor. CO2 is an invisible gas. It's when you open your Coca-Cola bottle or can, and the fizz, that's CO2 that's pumped into carbonated beverages.
Aren't we made of CO2 also?
Yes. We breathe out 40,000 parts per million CO2 into air that has less than 400 parts per million. So we breathe out more than 100 times the concentration in our breath that's in the air outside. The body is made up of many different elements, but 18% of our human body is carbon. So we're a carbon-based life form. The notion that CO2 increasing at this level and higher is a danger to our health is nonsense, because as I said, we breathe out far more than that we find in the atmosphere. It's not harmful in the classroom where your children are learning every day. Levels of 1,500 to 2,000 parts per million are not uncommon. That's 5 to 8 times what we find in the air outside in the playground. And that's true in most meeting areas, auditoriums, and workplaces. In cities, it's at least double what the ambient levels are, the atmospheric levels are in the rural areas.
And also it's food for plant life.
Sure.
So why do you think that the EPA registered it as a toxin?
Be able to control CO2 gives it a control over our use of fossil fuels and pushes the green agenda, which is to push us toward no carbon wind and solar and hydro, although that is not in favor in most green groups, tied technologies. They want to take coal and fossil fuel power plants out of the equation. They're certainly opposed to nuclear, worried about the dangers there.
Do you think that's justified on the nuclear part?
Well, I think that the Japanese
Fukushima
major problem has scared the world. It certainly scared Germany, who had stopped their big plans for nuclear just because of that. But Japan is right on the ring of fire, the tectonic ring around the Pacific, that's where the tectonic plates come together and push against each other, and earthquakes and volcanoes are most common. So it's not a good idea to place a nuclear power plant on a fault zone or on an area that's subject to major earthquakes, because that can cause some issues. Now,
I'm glad you're saying that. I'm really glad you're saying that, because sometimes when there are people that are for the use of nuclear power, I haven't heard them say something like that. So I appreciate that you're saying that, because I thought that their nuclear power plants were not mindfully placed or secured.
Right. I wouldn't put it on the San Andreas Fault in California either.
Right.
That wouldn't be advisable, but in other places and parts of the country that are stable, they're very safe as constructed today, and no emissions whatsoever, very efficient. And in the modern nuclear technology, there's not a lot of waste to dispose of. But carbon, the natural gas is another very clean burning fossil fuel, in this case fossil fuel, that can be used, and we have found huge supplies of it in the shale that exists in the ground, and ways to get at it that natural gas.